So I wanted to talk about the breathing tube for a minute because Dad had the reminder today that he was on the breathing tube, and so um, wanted to kind of walk through that a little bit. So Dad had his first surgery, came out of it fine, um, still had the obstruction in his bowels, and had to have that second surgery. And so I got a phone call right after his second surgery saying that your dad he couldn't breathe on his own. So they have to leave him on the breathing tube until he can do that. So I'm like, okay. So I didn't really know what that meant. I didn't understand it. And like, okay, the breathing tube is something stuck in his nose. Like, is it just something he has to have? Like, I didn't understand that. Basically, it was kind of life support for my dad. Um, so when you walk in and you first see that, um, I distinctly remember that they had, basically, they kind of got to either glaze over your eyes or tape them shut or something for the surgery so they can see and put the tube in your mouth and all these fun things. But my dad had this horrible glaze over his eyes where they were closed, but it looked like either taped shut or like something had covered them, and it was just so like Vaseline glossy. And then you look at the tubes that go into his mouth. It was really like scary because it's not like one tube. Dad he had the NG tube in his nose, so that's shitty for one. But then he also had this giant tube going down his throat, and this machine was hooked up to it, and all it would do was basically breathe for my dad. But what that means is like you're watching this person not be in control and not have the ability to like raise and lower their chest with their lungs, and so it's not as rhythmic as you think it would be. So it's not like normal breathing. Like when I first saw this, like there was almost like every breath was scary to watch, and every breath was like a horrible hiccup at the top of it, and it would come back down. You wait for the machine to kick in, and then it would come back down, and you keep waiting and you keep watching, but this horrible like compression and decompression sounds, and watching your dad on that is just one of the most heartbreaking things I've had to see, and watch him go through. And I just, but recalling that and trying to tell him, like going through that was just day one. And so dad had to be on this thing for 10 days. So usually they run random tests to see like if he's progressing. If the doctors feel like he's progressing and coming out of it, they will shut the machines down and see if he can breathe on his own. But all at the same time, they kind of take the oxygen levels down, and then they monitor it to see like how his vitals do. So if he's only on like 40% of the machine, or if he's only on 80% of the machine, or if he's on 100% oxygen, like what they have ways to throttle it back and forth based on what he needs. But this whole time, like, dad fails the first test, and so I'm like, oh god. So talking to the doctors, they said, yeah, usually we're about 14 days or so, and then we have to, we'll test him again, but we'll have to consider if he can't do it on his own, the tube that's down his throat will cause damage, and they would at that point consider a tracheotomy to, cut a hole in his throat and put a tube in that way so it doesn't mess with any other things in his throat. So for day 8, day 9, like it's making me nervous. Like dad hasn't passed this test yet. Finally, day 10, I get the call that says, he passed his test and he's off of his breathing tube, and it's so awesome. Like, we're going in there. Of course, he's still weak and tired, and he can't really. They say he can hear you. So of course, like I'm talking to dad, but I felt crazy. Like I don't know if that's weird or wrong, but I felt crazy at first. But as the days progressed, I got more and more comfortable talking to my dad when he's on this tube, and there were times where you can hold his hand and he'll squeeze it. He hears you, and that's what all the nurses and doctors say. Like when he's sedated like that and he's on a breathing tube, people hear you. And I think in those moments, like they appreciate it and like they acknowledge it somehow. And it's those moments where I feel like all of these things I did for my dad, like I knew it was for a reason. And, that was one of them where like I held his hand and he squeezed it and I just like he shook and he moved and those were the moments on why I did this. With my dad, of course, but like I feel he got through it, hopefully with my help. So um, wanted to touch on the breathing tube today because that was a scary one for sure. Talk soon.